Now, I have in my office a framed quotation, a member of the first church I served. I was associate pastor. I think it was actually the very first year of my serving there, and they gave me this framed quote, and it's a very simple quote that says, "We do not grow by knowing all the answers, but by living with the questions." We do not grow by knowing all the answers, but by living with the questions. And truth be told, I think they were prescient and very wise. It's a great gift for a young pastor, learning the ropes of ministry, thinking that one's job is to know all the answers, when really the job of a pastor is to ask the questions we should all be pursuing. The story Hayden read for us this morning, the story of the calming of the storm, is one of the most iconic images of the Gospels, particularly for me. In the 6 short verses of Mark's straightforward account of this miracle, we hear how Jesus, after teaching a great crowd, tells the disciples they need to get to the other side of the lake, and they get in the boat and they take off. And we're told other boats were with him. And then a great windstorm arises and the waves swell larger and larger, so much so that the boat is being swamped and about to sink. And then comes, I must confess, the oddest detail of the story is that we learn is Jesus is asleep in the stern of the boat. I mean, imagine that. The boat is tossing to and fro, the waves so strong that the disciples are filled with fear for their lives, yet Jesus is asleep on a cushion in the stern of the boat. Now, my wife accuses me of being able to sleep through just about anything, but the image of Jesus asleep in the stern of a boat about to sink by the violence of wind and wave makes me incredulous. How could Jesus be asleep in the midst of such tumult and violence? And the disciples themselves, their very lives at stake, their very lives sinking below the violent waves. They wake Jesus and they ask him the first, I think, of one of the most important questions that we human beings, we Christians, even ask ourselves. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Teacher, do you not care that we're dying here? And think about that as one of the most profound, most human questions all of us ask. Every one of us, disciples or not. It's questions we might ask of Jesus at any time. It's a question, I must be honest myself, that I've asked myself, and maybe even in my prayer in certain times of my life. Teacher, do you not care that I am perishing? Now, one of the gifts of the Gospels to me is they never shy away, they never avoid these hard questions. But they express them head on. And it's the depth of the question of every disciple like us who face in our lives must live in the midst of the storms of our lives. Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? I'm going to do a little segue here. I love history, in part because I love stories. And part of my love for history is learning new stories about the past, learning about people just like you and me who lived and died and struggled and succeeded and had joys and sorrows, people who danced and mourned, who lived their lives as best they could. In many ways, history to me is alive. The people in history, in many ways, are like witnesses to me, much like the passage in Hebrews that refers to, since I am surrounded by so great a cloud of witnesses. To me, that's why history is so alive, because it is filled with people who witness, not in their perfection, but in their struggles. And history is filled with people who experience beginnings and endings, triumphs and tragedies, who sing and weep. The people of history are my witnesses. In just these past few weeks, I've begun to learn a new history, a new story, a part of our history that I had never really heard before. Now, while I had grown up in Texas, I had never really heard the history of the story of Juneteenth and how it was celebrated through all these years among many African Americans. And it may be true for many of you. You've just learned the story, the history of this week with Juneteenth now becoming a national holiday. Juneteenth, the very day black slaves in Texas learned they were free. Now, if you don't know the whole story, a quick summation is that on Juneteenth, 1865, the Union Army arrived in Galveston, Texas, and told the slaves that Abraham Lincoln, 2 years earlier, the President of the United States, had issued the Emancipation Proclamation, setting all slaves free in the states in rebellion. And that is the historical facts of that history. But it occurs to me as I heard that this week, as I reflected on that and thought about that, what it doesn't capture is the response of those in that crowd who heard that news for the first time. They were free. And I try to imagine what was that like, the sheer joy of it, the sheer impossibility of it all. And I tried to imagine what was it like for those people, especially this week as I lived with that question I lived with this week in this Bible story. Jesus, do you not care we are perishing? Because I imagine, and I cannot but imagine, that the very people who heard that good news had spent generations asking Jesus, do you not care that we are perishing? If ever there was a people who had a right to ask that question, it was them. Had asked that very question for generation after generation as they lived in chains and lived lives of suffering we cannot imagine, where their very own children were sold away from their families and death could happen at the whim of a master. If anyone, it occurred to me, knew the history, if anyone in history could witness to the truth of storms, the reality of their perishing, who really lived with that question, it was those people, those slaves, who finally heard they were free. Now, I try not to, and probably shouldn't romanticize that moment too much by ignoring the truth that while that moment must have been as joyous as we can imagine, it was only a moment in the midst of a storm that would rage over and over again over even hundreds of years as the dream of freedom was lived in our broken world even unto this day. And yet, I imagine that for those who heard the good news, they were free, that in that moment, the storm was stilled. The vision of salvation, of liberation, was glimpsed for the very first time. That it's possible. Teacher, do you not care we are perishing is a great question every one of us wrestles with. And in our story, Jesus wakes up, and I love how it says, rebukes the wind. Rebukes the wind. Peace, be still. And as I read those words, it occurs to me that those are words not only directed at the wind and the waves, but maybe even to the disciples in the boat. That the faith Jesus encourages in the disciples, that even as the boat is tossed around and swamped by the waves, to have enough faith to live with the question. To be still in the midst of the question. To let go of the fear enough that even as the boats of our lives seemed overwhelmed, we have the assurance of the peace of Christ. Now, there's a question at the very end of this story that I probably should have paid more attention to. That's a very important question to kind of go along with that question of Jesus, do you not care we are perishing? When we feel like Jesus is asleep in the back of the boat on the cushion in our lives. And that question is that the disciples were in awe, and they ask, it's interesting what they ask, who then is this that even the wind and sea obey him? Who do we say this Jesus is that even the wind and the sea obey him? And we might say this is the Son of God, this is the Messiah. But I think what it means to me, and it's just one of my answers to this question, important to me to maybe be still and quiet in the midst of the storms, is that what Jesus is God with us. It's Emmanuel, God with us. That God is in the boat, in the midst of the waves and the windstorm. That answer to that question creates a sense that maybe I can be quiet and still even in the midst of the difficult storms that shatter our lives, even in the difficult storms that shatter our world around us so that we feel we might be swamped. I truly believe and have faith that God is right there in the boat with us. And that's enough. To God be the glory this day and forevermore. Amen.